Howdy gamers! After I hit gold for the first time, I wanted to make a video about what I did to get there. When I hit silver, I made a video about the process that got me there. And while I still think my process is what helped me the most, it hasn't really changed since then. So this video will cover the skills I focused on during my climb from bronze to gold. You don't need to watch the video about my process, but it will add a bit of context, and you might get more value out of this video if you do. Now let's get into the details. Before each game, I would pick one or two learning objectives to focus on. Simply put, a learning objective is just a skill to focus on learning while playing out a game. Eternal Return is pretty complicated, so picking a specific skill to focus on made the learning process much easier. The big payoff was that with enough focused practice, I could often develop these skills into habits. This in turn gave me more room to focus on developing other skills. In total, there were basically 6 things I used as learning objectives. The first was just getting my build done fast, since I figured that was the single most important skill. Though this begs the question, how quickly do you need to go to be fast? When I first started focusing on my build speed, I thought leaving my first zone around a minute into the game was fast, and I would often struggle to finish my builds by the end of night 1. Since then, I've realized that's actually pretty slow. Now I start feeling behind if it takes much more than 30 seconds to start leaving my first zone. And on one of the faster builds I've used, I feel behind if I haven't collected almost everything by the start of night 1. Granted, it's a build that I used to contest first tree, but it's still way faster than I would have thought possible when I started my journey. Being able to cut my first zone time in half shows that build speed was something I desperately needed to work on. The payoff was getting extra time to do literally anything else. In a game where you're always racing against other players to become as strong as possible, time is easily one of the most valuable resources. However, extra time doesn't really do much for you if you don't have the information to make good decisions. This brings me to the second skill I developed early on, which was pressing the Alt key when I ran into people. This used to be the only way to throw up the overlay that shows you people's weapon grade, mastery level, and whichever boxes you haven't opened. It's quite helpful for figuring out who's really ahead or behind at a glance, since weapon mastery tends to be directly correlated with strength. I had decided on this skill because I was getting killed before I had my weapon done pretty often. Though over time, it became less useful for that specific purpose, because I got faster at building my own weapon. And more recently, Nimble Neuron added the option to turn the overlay on permanently, so I don't need to press the button anymore, though I do still press it out of habit. After I felt good about my build speed and pressing Alt habit, I moved on to Minimap awareness. My objective was just to make sure I was looking at the minimap when I wasn't really doing anything else. This objective was spurred on by my fastest ranked game ever. That game, I just wasn't looking at the minimap. At all. But if I had, I probably wouldn't have been able to make such good time. Needless to say, being more aware of people's position has greatly improved my survivability and has allowed me to make more informed decisions in all stages of the game. The objective I developed along with Minimap awareness was making transition items. During my climb, I only played Kathy, and she's infamously dependent on the transition item Fragorect to succeed. So making sure I could take any chance to build it was important. Now, the recipe itself is simple. Basically just Force Core plus Base Dagger. The real challenge is in being able to get the Force Core. Building it requires 2 different objective/RNG resources, so I had to make sure that I could be at those objectives on spawn whenever possible. The best case scenario was arriving on spawn and getting the materials uncontested. However, getting materials uncontested was fairly rare, so I had to get a little creative. One of the biggest improvements was just recognizing that there were a lot of chances to get these materials by burning timer. Sometimes zones that will have a meteorite or tree of life close before they spawn, and this often let me get those materials uncontested. There were many games where going for red zone materials was the difference between being able to make Fragorect or not. Now, the last big objective was just farming. My hunt scores in games tended to be pretty low, and it was definitely impacting my ability to climb. In my reviews, I had started noticing that even in games where I made Fragorect and got a few kills, I was getting wrecked by people with little to no kills. This didn't make a lot of sense at first, but then I started noticing that these people had much higher hunt scores than me. The game it became most apparent was one where I had Chinese opera mask and 3 kills to my name. I was pretty sure I had a good chance of winning, but then a lead Eileen showed up. She had no transition items and no kills, but she had 41 hunt score to my 16. So after that, I decided it was time to focus on farming. Other than that, the only thing I ever set as an objective was wall stunning people with Kathy's E, though I didn't stick with it for too long for a few reasons. The main reason is that I would forget it was even an objective. You aren't guaranteed to fight early, and most of the time I'd forget about it by the time I did fight people. Heck, sometimes I'd remember, but I wouldn't be able to practice since we weren't nearby any walls, or I just needed to run away. This combination of me just plain old forgetting, combined with the times I did remember but couldn't actually practice it, led me to drop the objective pretty quickly. I just didn't feel like I could get much value from it since it was so inconsistent. For me, the learning objectives that worked the best were either things I could work on at the beginning of the game, like looking at the minimap, or stuff that was integral to my game plan and thus unforgettable, like making Fragarack. Anything else just seemed like it was going to have similar issues to the wall stunning objective. It would either be irrelevant most of the game, or I'd just forget about it. So now that I've described the learning objectives I used, and discussed what seemed to work or not work, I'd like to show you that what I've focused on wasn't anything fancy. You can summarize the goal for most objectives as make my numbers bigger fast. The point of building my items quickly is to make my numbers big fast. Making Fragarack means making an item with really big numbers, which again means making my numbers bigger. And farming is really just the same thing, but with levels and mastery making my numbers bigger instead of items. If I group these together, making numbers big fast was present as a learning objective in 85% of my games. This might seem pretty high, but if your numbers are too small, you basically don't get to play the game. And on the flip side, if your numbers are really big, you can kinda just run at someone and stat stick them to death. You could similarly group pressing Alt and looking at the minimap as just looking at people or gathering information, and together they had a 40% presence. The only thing remaining that could maybe be considered fancy is wall stunning, since it sometimes involves outplaying your opponent. However, we already discussed why it didn't work well for me, and overall its presence was only 3.7%. So nothing that I really focused on hard was notably fancy or flashy. It was really just the basics of the game. Making sure I was getting places fast, looking at the minimap, and making sure I smacked animals. Now, this isn't to say that you should just ignore everything else. Even in games where my learning objective was farming, I'd still review a lot of my fights, or try to think of better ways to get my hands on Fragarack materials. However, when I was in the middle of a game with farming as my objective, those things were secondary to making sure I was farming as well as I could. This led to a lot of missed opportunities from taking the time to farm a bit too much. But now I have a much better idea of how much farming I can get away with before it gets in the way of my win conditions. I'm going to reiterate that I was still trying to improve at other skills, but they took a backseat to the basics. Trying to get fancy and outplay people is fun, but I feel like it got me into more trouble than anything. Like when I tried to outplay a Hyunwoo with dagger skill. I'd seen Everite, a Titan Cathy player, avoid Hyunwoo's wall slam by using dagger skill. But when I tried it, I got Hyunwoo instead. Which was a shame since I'd just gotten free wick, a Fragarack, and a Chinese opera mask. So with that, my video is basically done. But before I end it, I'd like to thank and give a shout out to the people who inspired me to do this improvement experiment and start my channel. First, I'd like to thank Coach Curtis and Nathan Mott for the Broken by Concept podcast. My process and focus on the basics was a direct result of following their advice. It's technically a League of Legends podcast, but most of their advice about improvements isn't really specific to League, which is why it has worked for me for Eternal Return. Even if you're not that interested in League, I highly recommend you at least check it out. They've said a lot more on the topic of improvement than I have, and in much more detail, so make sure you check them out. I'd also like to thank Scaz. His videos and stream really helped me get into the game when I was just starting out. If you're remotely new to the game, I highly recommend you check out his channel. A lot of his videos were helpful to me, and some of them explain stuff about the game that isn't very intuitive. And now, I'd like to thank you, the viewer, for watching all the way through. If this video helped you in any way, please let me know. Making these videos takes up a lot of my free time, but seeing a comment, like, or new subscriber lets me know the video is worth making. Good luck on Lumia Island, and I hope to see you again.